This event took place quite a few years ago, so unfortunately I don't remember everything that happened, but I remember nearly all of it. Anyways, this happened when I was around 4 or 5 years old, and on Easter Sunday. My family always gathers at my grandmother's house to celebrate holidays, birthdays, so as we do every holiday, my mother and I started our hour-long trip to her house. We were probably around 20 minutes away from our destination when my mom noticed that we were a little low on gas. So we pulled into this old, almost rustic looking gas station with just a handful of customers inside. It was red and white with a few festive decorations outside and lots of Easter stickers on the two large glass windows that were on either side of the door. My mom, having taught me not to talk to strangers nor open the car doors for anyone but her, trusted me enough to leave me in the car alone as she went inside briefly to pay for gas. She told me that she would be right back before going into the gas station. It felt nice that day, so the windows in the car were down so we could feel the breeze while driving instead of the AC. While I was waiting on my mom, I remember adjusting the colorful paper clippings in my Easter basket next to me, then looking out of the backseat window. When I looked over, I saw a tall, older man, maybe around 30 or 40 years old, approaching my window. He crouched down slightly and looked at me. "Hi there. What's your name?" I remember him saying. At this moment, I remembered that I wasn't supposed to talk to strangers. So I told the man that my mom says I shouldn't speak to strangers. He then replied with, "Well, we can be friends then. My name's Charlie, and now that you know, I guess I'm not a stranger, huh?" At the time, I thought he was right. In my mind, I thought, since a stranger is someone you don't know, this man wasn't a stranger anymore because I knew his name. The man and I had a short conversation that I don't quite remember. All I remember is him telling me that he had a nice Easter basket. At this point, I started to get a sick feeling in my stomach, but being a child, of course, I didn't know why. My mom then walked out of the gas station and noticed the man immediately and began approaching the car quickly, asking the man what he thinks he's doing. The man seems to panic, and he pulls my door handle violently. He quickly realized that it was locked and proceeded to reach into my window and grab me by one of my wrists and attempt to pull me out. This obviously scared me a lot, causing me to panic and pull against him on instinct. This caused him to let go and take off running. My mom quickly ran to the car and I unlocked the doors. She grabbed me and pulled me into an almost painful bear hug, then inspected me closely, repeatedly asking if I was okay. I ended up with a slight bruise on my arm where he grabbed me, but other than that, I was just shaken up. The reality of what had just happened set in at this moment, and I remember just crying and holding on to my mom right after I said I was okay. I don't remember anything after this point, but I recently asked my mom about it, and she said that she called the police immediately after. To this day, my mom still says that that was the most frightening moment of her life, and claims that if she had gotten there any later and came back to an empty car, she wouldn't have been able to live with herself. I'm half Japanese, female, living in Japan, and work as a translator-interpreter. A few years ago, I got hired for an awesome project as an interpreter for a producer and an award-winning director for a movie that was to be filmed in Okinawa. Anyway, we got flown to Okinawa, and I was excited on so many accounts. Plus, it's my first time to Okinawa. Everything was amazing. The friendly, warm Okinawa people, the food, the weather, and the beautiful beaches. Until we reached the resort hotel. 3 key team members, including myself, were on the same floor. Our rooms were side by side. I remember as I walked up to my room door, I felt something was off. I knocked firmly 3 times on the door. and as I opened the door to the room, about 6 feet away, I saw an apparition of a lady standing there looking at me. Well, shit, but I had no choice. I'm here for work. She looked like a Japanese lady in her 20s or 30s, with long dark hair. It was neat. She was wearing a long light-colored bluish-white dress with some sort of faint floral print, as if it had faded with time. She also looked darkish overall, energy-wise, if that makes sense. Like there's a slight darkish gray mist surrounding her. I stood at the entrance and spoke politely in Japanese. "Hello, excuse me. I'm not here to disturb your peace or your space. I'm here just for 3 days for work, and I will leave after that. Thank you for understanding." I bowed deeply before entering. It seems like she understood me and mostly left me alone, although she barely leaves the spot she was standing at and just watches me whenever I'm in the room. Each time I have to enter or leave the room, or have to go to the kitchen, toilet, bath areas, I would have to walk by her. My best friend was in between jobs then, and whenever I got back in the hotel room, she would spend the entire time on the phone with me so that I was less afraid. Since being on the phone means I'm distracted from the lady who was always looking at me. I could feel her watching me even as I showered, so I had to have my best friend on the speakerphone while I showered. The kitchen area near where she usually stands is always colder than the rest of the room, even though the air conditioning isn't there. I was really grateful that it was a quiet, spacious room, enough for 4 people. There were 2 beds and 2 futons for the tatami area, so this gives me some space between me and the staring lady. I slept with the lights and TV on, but around 2 or 3 a.m. I would wake up in shock, and that's because she had come close to me and watched me sleep. It happened every night I was there. I get a feeling that she was just curious about someone who could see her, but nonetheless, it was quite a nerve-wracking experience. Before I left, I bowed to her again and thanked her for sharing her space. This happened 5 years ago. I used to live alone in a small flat in England, about an hour south of London. It was a medium-sized town well known for being a good place to live, with excellent schools, low crime rates, and minimal unemployment. The kind of place where people didn't panic if they left their front door unlocked when they left for work. My flat was on the first floor above pavement level, midway downhill. There was nobody underneath me. My flat was kind of a bridge with a footpath below it, and my kitchen window was directly over a pavement on a fairly busy road. The flat had a small galley kitchen, a living room, and an upstairs bedroom. There was nobody beneath or above my flat, and because of the hill, my kitchen window was literally face-on with the pavement where people walked. There was a printing company opposite that went out of business, and then just grass. I always used to close the blinds once the sun had gone down, but liked having the kitchen window open during the afternoons. It had a safety latch, so it didn't open far enough for anybody to reach in, and I wasn't on the ground floor, so I didn't worry too much. One day, I got home from work early, and as it was the summer, I had the kitchen window open and the blinds open. I'm chopping garlic for my dinner, glance up and see an older man literally standing on the pavement, watching me, only a few feet away. I glare back as if to say, "Go away," and decide to walk out of the kitchen into the living room, as if I am talking to someone. I walk back into the kitchen, glance at the window, and the man is still there, watching me with a smile on his face. At this point, I'm slightly panicking. I'm alone, nobody is around as I have no direct neighbors. I go into the living room and sit against the wall, clutching my phone. I didn't want him to be able to see me at all. A lot of front doors in England have a kind of 2-door system. Directly on the street you have a glass door and a proper wooden door inside. I had been out for a smoke, so the glass door was shut and locked, but the wooden door was wide open. From where I am sitting, I can see the glass door, and I see a figure walking towards it. Sure enough, as it gets closer, I can see that it's the man from the pavement, standing at my front door and trying to look in. He tries opening the door, but thank God I locked the outside door after my smoke, and it was a strong door. He drops a cigarette, says fuck it, and after 15 to 20 seconds, he turns around and walks away. I run to shut and lock the wooden door and go to the kitchen window as he walks away and down the road. Just before he turns the corner, he turns around and smiles at me, making eye contact. A few days later, it was on local news that a man matching his description assaulted a number of young women in my neighborhood. Creepy guy, please let's never meet. My grandfather was a badass. He was born in Alberta during the early 30s and raised his 3 brothers on a reservation from the time he was 9. When his parents left for BC with their only daughter, promised to return, and none of the boys ever saw them again. To make ends meet, he learned carpentry and worked as a laborer, and bare-knuckle boxed against older men for extra cash. He learned how to track and hunt, and always came home with something to eat when work was scarce. When he was 14, he put the second oldest brother in charge of the household, left the rest in search of his parents and a better life, and never went back. That was the last time he saw any of his family members. He spent several months riding the rails, befriending some transits while using his fighting skills to defend himself against others. He eventually made his way to Vancouver, the last known whereabouts of his parents and sister, and started working in a pulp mill. At 17, he met my grandmother, and the two eventually married, leading him to giving up his search for his family. They bought some land, and he spent his free time building several houses, which still stand today. One of those sat on the land he bought with my grandmother, which included acres of wooded area. On this land, my grandparents kept horses and dogs, and small farm animals for eggs and meat. My aunt was born in the early 50s, and then my mother came along right before the end of the decade. As far as I've heard, nothing bad or strange really happened, until my mom found an old Ouija board and played with it by herself. But I don't know if that has any relation to this story. My mother was around 8 when she was riding her horse through the wooded part of their acreage, when the horse stopped dead in its tracks. My mom tried to spur it on, but it was frozen in fear, and all of a sudden she smelled something like rotting garbage and meat. She pulled back on the reins, and the horse instantly turned and took off back towards the house, almost knocking her off its back several times along the way. Afterwards, that horse was never the same. It would try to kick her, and if she got on it, it would fall backwards trying to crush her beneath it. Once it started acting like its old self again, letting her climb onto it, but once she did, it ran towards the road and stopped abruptly, bucking her forward into the path of an oncoming car. My grandpa saw it happen and put a shotgun to its head, and the horse just kept breathing heavily and staring straight ahead. My mother barely missed being run over by a car that saw the horse coming and managed to swerve out of the way, and my grandmother begged my grandfather not to shoot the horse. He finally decided to give it away when he saw my mother wasn't badly injured. That same horse fell on the next person to ride it, breaking her collarbone, and the father did what my grandpa said he should have done the first time. After that, animals started going missing, and one of the hunting dogs was injured by something during an attack at night. My grandpa set out some traps and stayed in the hayloft above the barn with a shotgun and rifle beside him, and slept out there for several nights.
He figured it was foxes, or maybe coyotes or wolves, or even a desperate bear, which is what he attributed the smell in the woods to and the horse's reason for losing its mind. But nothing came the entire time he slept out there, and eventually he figured it had moved on to easier prey, or died. The day after he stopped sleeping in the barn, my mom was out near the tree line playing with the injured dog as it was healing. Out of nowhere, the dog started sniffing the air, then positioned itself between my mom and the trees, growling and barking. My grandpa heard the noise and came out, stopped in his tracks, and called back to my grandmother to bring his rifle, then whistled for the dogs. My grandma came out, handed him his gun, then asked what was going on. As the dogs all started to react like the first one, my grandfather pointed to one of the treetops, which looked longer and thicker than those around it, but it was very slightly moving. It was at least 6 feet tall. He told me later on when he'd retell the story, but probably a good bit taller. He took aim and fired just as he saw a pair of wings start to open up. Whatever was up there was watching them, but he beat it to the punch. It was a kill shot, directly in the chest with a high-powered rifle, and he instantly started running forward with all of the dogs following him as the thing plummeted to the ground. The breaking of tree branches wholly unmistakable. When he reached the impact point, he raised his rifle again and commanded the dogs forward to flush it out. But they all just stood in the spot and kept spinning around, trying to catch a scent that seemingly disappeared. A pile of broken branches lay in an obvious landing spot, but beyond that there was no proof that anything had happened. No body, no blood, no trail. It either disappeared or gone straight back up the way it came. He searched those woods for several days, but never found a sign of what that thing was, and they didn't see it or experience the issues with the animals after that. Decades later, when he was dying, he kept talking about how he saw something. In his delirium, he referred to it as an alien, but said it was coming back for him. I've never seen that man scared of anything in my life, but there was actual panic and fear in his voice. A few nights before he died, he had already been too weak to stand on his own for several days, and my grandmother awoke to the sound of a gunshot. She ran outside, fearing the worst, and saw my grandpa lowering his rifle, staring at something in the distance. She took the gun away and helped him back inside, and that was it. I don't know if whatever it was actually did come back for him, or if it was a hallucination of an old memory, but I'd like to think he went out with a final fuck you to that thing that tried to torment his family all those years ago. My name is Rick Martinez, and I am a retired truck driver. This happened when I was like 30 years old. I am now 62. On the road, I have seen many strange things. I have told this story over and over. A lot of people don't believe me, but it starts off in Stockton, California, where I picked up a load of pipe. My destination was Salt Lake City, Utah. I was supposed to refuel in Barstow, California at a truck stop, but lo and behold, they were out of fuel. So I told my supervisor, "Hey, I got like half a tank of fuel." He told me to continue and hit the first truck stop I saw. So, 100 miles into Nevada, nothing but desert. Seen nothing but a sparsely lit desert with a couple of towns. When I noticed my gauge set was reading empty, and I'm thinking, that's not right. So I took the first exit I saw and pulled over. Told my supervisor, who was right behind me an hour away, that I was afraid to continue on and to run the tanks dry. So he told me to sit still, and he would be in an hour and we could siphon some of the fuel from his tanks into mine. As I sat there, I couldn't run the engine, so I couldn't listen to the radio. So I sat there in silence. I don't do drugs, and I didn't make this up, so listen carefully. As I'm sitting there, I notice a lot of undone construction. A trailer park to my right, completely dark, and a church off to my left, about a block away with its lights on. It's about 2 a.m., and I see this jackrabbit hopping around my truck. It hops around and just stares at me and keeps hopping around. So I'm getting hungry, and I notice what looks like to be a convenience store another block away from the church. So I get out of my truck and decide to walk to the store. While I'm walking, I keep hearing this dog howling like it's in pain. As I'm passing the church, the two doors are wide open, and I hear clapping like they're having a service. As I pass the church, I look inside, and there's no one except for this skinny white old man reading from the Bible and talking about hell. I don't linger too long and pass the church. Then I heard clapping again, and the dog howling at the same time. I notice there's a bunch of empty houses on this street. I still am making my way towards what I think is a little mini-mart. All the while, this dog keeps howling. As I go inside, this little old lady with glasses is reading a book. There's hardly anything in this store. Maybe a few cans of food, a couple bags of chips, only water in the refrigerators. The whole time, the lady didn't even pick her head up from the book. So I grab water, grab chips, and I ask the old lady, "Is this all you have, and where's everybody at?" She told me everybody moved out and new construction was supposed to begin like 6 months ago, and she didn't say anything after that. So I paid her and walked out and started walking back towards the truck. The whole time the dog is still howling. So as I got closer towards the church, I looked up at the street towards where I heard the howling from. I decided to go see for myself why the dog was howling. Houses on both sides of the street are boarded up and dark. I saw a house with the lights on, with about a 5-foot fence. When I looked over the fence, I was in shock. What I saw was a man in his underwear with a chain attached to his neck on all fours, howling. The hairs on my arms and neck stood up as I saw this other man burst through the back door and kick the man on all fours and was yelling at him to shut up. He ran into a doghouse. I was in shock and turned and ran back down the hill to my truck. As I passed the church, both doors still wide open, but there were no lights on anymore, and still I hear the clapping. Finally, I made it to my truck, called my supervisor and told him what I saw. I told him to hurry up and get here so I can leave. My supervisor asked what exit I was talking about, and I told him, and he said, "Oh, I passed that." He had to turn around and come back to get me. So I'm sitting there, and the rabbit is still hopping around my truck. It stopped and looked at me, and as I'm sitting in my truck, I'm not saying the rabbit said it, but this is what I heard. "Leave." I rolled up the window and waited for my supervisor, who showed up 5 minutes after. I told my supervisor what happened, and he just laughed at me and told me I'm going to have to drug test you. I did not sleep on that whole trip to Utah until I got to Salt Lake City. Believe it or not, I swear this is what happened. I don't know how many of you will remember this, but in the summer of 2003, there were widespread power outages in the northeast region of the United States, plus parts of Canada. I was 11 years old and was living with my grandma in an old suburb of Staten Island, New York. Because of this story, I'll always distinctly remember those 2 to 3 days without power. At the time, my family had just recently moved into a new house and had probably only been there for a few months. The house was old, probably built in the early to mid-1900s. As soon as we moved in, we immediately felt something in the house. Cold spots, random noises, shadows, voices. We realized that the house was haunted, but we never really felt that we had to leave because of it. My grandma and mom are sensitive to spirits, and we lived in other haunted houses before, so we were kind of used to it.
Our ancestral house in the Philippines was much worse, so we really weren't in a rush to move so quickly after just moving in. In this house, I only ever saw shadows and heard voices, while my grandma and mom saw full-body apparitions. That is, until the blackout happened. So one night during the blackout, it was hot as hell. The temperature was probably in the high 80s and low 90s, with no air conditioning due to the power outages. So I asked my grandmother if I could sleep in her room since it was on the 3rd floor, in the coolest part of the house. She obliged, and I fell asleep next to my grandmother after playing Pokemon on my Game Boy under the covers for a few hours. I was woken up by a strange noise in the middle of the night a few hours later. It was freezing cold, so cold that I forgot about the power outage and thought the AC was on. The noise sounded like a distant wailing, kind of like a really high-pitched police siren if it was a block away. It was loud enough to wake me, but somehow still sounded really far away. At this point, I'm not really thinking much of it since the window was open and I assumed the noise was coming from outside. I'm still under the covers and wide awake, so I grab my Game Boy and start playing Pokemon in silence so that I don't wake my grandmother. I was obsessed with the game. As I'm playing, I noticed the noise getting louder and closer. This continued for another minute or so until I start to get really annoyed. Just as I was about to pull the covers off to investigate, I feel a weight shift on the bed, and I hear the mattress spring squeak by the foot of the bed. I look over to check if my grandma was still there or if she somehow left without me knowing. She didn't. She was still there. I slowly peek out from under the covers and see a pale-skinned woman with long dark hair sitting by the foot of the bed. She was wearing a light-colored dress and faced towards the wall. Her hands were pressed against her face and eyes, and she was crying, which I now realize is the noise I had been hearing. I was terrified and shaking, so I turned to wake my grandmother, but I realize she's already sitting up and praying the rosary in silence. She then turned to me and said, "Don't worry, she won't hurt you. She visits me every night." I'll never forget it. I was freaked out and just shut my eyes until I fell back asleep. Anyways, after that night, I never slept in my grandmother's room again. I continued to feel a presence in the house, but I never heard the wailing or saw the woman again. My grandmother, on the other hand, said that the woman continued her nightly visits until we moved a year later. Let's call her Sam. All throughout high school, and even for a bit afterwards, we were best friends. Even though we were best friends, I felt like I didn't really know her, if that makes sense. We were pretty wild teenagers, drinking, smoking, hanging out with older guys. Sam always dated super sketchy guys. When we were 16, Sam started dating a 27-year-old named John. I had my fair share of dating guys way too old for me as well, though, so I didn't see anything wrong with it. Also, predators have a special way of making you feel like there's nothing wrong with what they're doing. I have my fair share of trauma due to older men from that time in my life, but that's a story for another time. She didn't have a car at the time, so she would regularly ask me to drop her off at his place to hang out and cover for her if her mom contacted me. Being an idiot teenager, I was like, yeah, sure, whatever. She's my homegirl, and I know she'd do the same for me. Plus, I'd met John several times before, and he seemed decent enough at the time. He would give us alcohol and stuff, and would invite us over to party with his equally disgusting friends. Their relationship seemed fine at first, but turned toxic within a few months. He would constantly demand to track her phone location and control what she wore. He also cheated on her multiple times. but she always stayed. During the time this happened, I stopped driving her to see him. One time, she called me begging me to drive her to see him. I said no. She went on to explain that he was drunk, and if I wouldn't, then he would pick her up, and if they got in a crash due to drunk driving, it would be my fault. So, I drove her to his house. I was furious with John at this point for hurting my best friend, and I had a rebellious teenage give no fucks attitude, so as soon as I walked into his house to drop Sam off, I started screaming at him for being a manipulative piece of shit. His response, and the dark and twisted yet emotionless look in his eyes, still gives me chills to this day. I could break your neck so easily. Thankfully, I was standing right by the front door, so I ran out to my car and immediately sped off. The next couple of years are kind of fuzzy, but basically they were constantly breaking up and getting back together. Sam dated a string of other guys, but would always cheat on them with John. When we were 18, this is when things started getting progressively weirder, and I started to distance myself from Sam because of it. Long story short, Sam had a new boyfriend who she seemed crazy about, and I was so relieved because she finally seemed over John. Then, she heard through the grapevine that John got engaged, and she became irate. We were hanging out when she heard the news, and she was like, "I just have to go home and process this." So she immediately left, and I was like, whatever, I'll give her space. She calls me a few hours later and was talking super fast and laughing a lot. I was like, "You good?" She was like, "Yeah, I just broke into John's apartment and smashed all of his shit. I know that I have this new guy I'm dating, but I've been hooking up with John still. Don't hate me, and I'm sorry I didn't tell you. But anyway, I feel so great I broke his TV and cut up all of his sheets. Too bad John and his fiancée weren't home." I had never seen her like this before, and was so alarmed. What would she have done if they were home? The break-in was never reported to the police because she told John it was her, and that if they went to the police, John's fiancée likely would have found out that he was cheating on her with Sam. Now, at this point, a smart person would completely cut her off, but I didn't. I stopped hanging out with her as much as I could, and we naturally grew distant because I had moved across the country for college. But we would text and FaceTime every couple of weeks. So at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, so what about the murder? Hang tight, we're almost there. In 2018, John's fiancée was found dead. The police immediately ruled it as a suicide because there was a note and the gun was found in her hand. But all of her friends and family insisted that she would never do that. She was known to everyone as being extremely positive and cheerful. They pressured the cops to investigate more, and lo and behold, 1 year later, John was found guilty of murdering her. He's currently in prison, and it chills me to the bone knowing that I was in his house on multiple occasions and used to frequently hang out with him. So now, moving on to why I think my friend may have had something to do with it. Last year, she was visiting my city and asked to meet up for dinner. I was like, sure, why not? We're going to be in public and I do miss her, and it'd be nice to catch up. While we were at dinner, she had her phone on the table and I saw a call from the name Jail ringing into her phone. She quickly excused herself to take the call and was gone for a couple of minutes. When she got back, I was like, what the fuck? She explained to me that she visits John in prison regularly and they talk on the phone every day. I was like, why? He was found guilty of murder. Why would you want anything to do with him? And she looked at me dead in the eyes with a look of pure evil and malice and said, I'm the only one who knows what actually happened. Nobody else knows the truth. I quickly changed the subject and finished my dinner really quickly and made an excuse to leave. I was terrified at this point, and I had no idea what she was capable of. I hightailed it back to my apartment and blocked her on everything. I haven't spoken to her since. I know this isn't solid proof that she was involved, but her past behavior, coupled with that chilling comment and the fact that she regularly visited a convicted murderer in prison, leads me to believe she had something to do with it. At the very least, she knows much more than she's admitting. Sam, let's never fucking meet again.